Hello. This is a video series of video segments on effective instruction. All good teachers need to be able to do four things. They need to be curricularly clear about what it is they want to accomplish by the end of a lesson. They need instructionally to engage their learners as actively as possible. They need to be able to check for understanding and collect data on who learned what. And they need to gain and maintain student cooperation managing the classroom. In this segment, we'll take a look at checking for understanding, the what, why, how, and when teachers check for understanding. Checking for understanding is a planned process by which teachers elicit evidence of student progress in terms of the learning, and then they use that evidence to make their instructional decisions. Essentially, teachers have to be able to do three things when they check for understanding. They have to be able to do CIA, collect information, interpret that information, and act on that information. CIA, collect, interpret, and act. Here are a couple examples. If I'm lecturing on the four causes of the Civil War, the next day I might start the lesson by saying to the students, yesterday we talked about the four causes of the Civil War. Use the paper you picked up on the way in to jot down what those causes are. Now, it's important that you as the teacher move around the room collecting information on how your students are doing with that. What did they learn? What did they remember from yesterday? You interpret that, and then you decide, do they all have it? Can I build on it and go on? Or do I need to reinforce one or two of the causes? Are some of them missing? They have three, but they don't have the fourth. Collect, interpret, act. Likewise, in an elementary classroom, if you're doing math, and students are doing a math problem, the teacher may say, all right, before we go on to independent practice, let's try one more. And while the students are trying one more, the teacher moves around the room. Some students may have it, and the teacher can say, go ahead. Some students may need to do one more of those problems, and the teacher may say, all right, do problem 7, and then bring it to me. And then there may be a group of students, small in number, that the teacher needs to bring together and reteach. So in those situations, the teacher collects the information, interprets it, and acts on it. Why do we check for understanding? We need to collect evidence on what students have learned to make effective instructional decisions. It's not a matter of plowing forward and covering content. It's about learning. Here are a couple more examples. One good way to check for understanding when lecturing or using a video is to use the strategy called 10-2, increasing engagement in lecture. Essentially, what one does when one uses 10-2 is you teach for 10 minutes or you show a video for 10 minutes and then you stop and you ask a question or you give the students something to do. So if I'm showing a video on the phases of matter, I might stop the video after 10 minutes and say to the students, all right, now take 2 minutes and jot down your summary of what you've heard so far. And of course then, to collect that information, I need to move around the room, see what they're doing, and based on that, interpret it and decide, can I continue with the video or do I need to clarify any misconceptions? Likewise, in an elementary classroom, after a short description of neighborhoods, a teacher might say, all right, let's pause here for a minute, and I'm going to ask you to think about what are the characteristics we've talked about in our neighborhoods. And then ask the students to turn to a partner and share the characteristics. Now, while the students are turning to a partner, the teacher, again, needs to move, collect information, and interpret it. She can also get more information by calling on students. And oftentimes, when you ask students to turn to the partner, what you should do is call on students without their hands up. Don't take the volunteers, take the non-volunteers. That'll give you better information to interpret from. And then you need to decide, do they have it? Can I go on? Or do I need to reteach? Another method to check for understanding is using hand signals. Now, hand signals, which should always be private, are often agree altogether, disagree apart, or in an elementary classroom they can be thumbs up, thumbs down, or this way if you're not quite sure. And so if I'm in a biology classroom teaching about blood flow through the heart, I might say, all right, now we've gone over blood flow through the heart. Respond to this statement. I can effectively describe how the blood flows through the heart. Agree with that statement, disagree with that statement, not quite sure. It's important to use private signals, whether it's thumbs up or disagree and agree. Because when students see signals like this, they tend to not give you their answer. They tend to give you the answer of the good student that they're looking at. So keep that in mind. Here's an example of what not to do when you're checking for understanding. And it's often done in classrooms. When teachers ask any questions, they often don't mean, students, do you have any questions? What they mean to do is use it as a cue, meaning any questions, all right, I'm done with this part, I'm ready to move on. And so I encourage you not to use that unless you're willing to follow it up with this. When you say any questions, if you don't get one, you need to ask a question. When you check for understanding, when can you do that? Well, at almost any point during the lesson, you can check for understanding. In the beginning of class, as a bell ringer or a do now, something on the board for students to do as they come into the room, as long as you move around the room and collect information, that's a way to check for understanding. After lecturing in the middle of the period, stopping after 10 minutes of talk and giving them 2 minutes of processing using that 10-2 activity, that's a time that you can check for understanding. Or at the end of the period, as a closure activity using an exit slip, students fill out and they give it to you as they go out the door, that's another time when you can check for understanding. So in terms of when, it can be almost any time during the lesson. A key component, though, is when you check for understanding, it should be focused on the key learning. What is the key learning? And that's what your checking for understanding should be focused on. Likewise, when you, for example, at the end of the period, you get those exit slips, that gives you some time to kind of look it over and decide, interpret that information, and then act on it the next day as you start class. Checking for understanding requires teachers to be clear about what it is they're trying to teach, and then to assess their learners and collect some data on who's learned what. It's an essential skill, and the saying goes, the time to check for understanding is before the test. When you're handing out that test, you should have a general idea of how well your students will do because you've checked for understanding.